Imagine this. Mist drifts across a quiet Japanese plain, the sky painted with the pale blush of dawn. A single warrior stands at the edge of the horizon, his armor catching the first glimmers of light, his hand resting on the hilt of a blade said to carry not just steel, but spirit. You hear the rustle of silk banners in the wind, the distant echo of temple bells, and the low thunder of hoofbeats from wars long past. They called themselves samurai, those who serve. But what did it truly mean to live by the edge of a sword, to walk a path where honor was worth more than life itself? Come closer. Step with me into 1,000 years of history, where loyalty and betrayal, beauty and blood, faith and fire wove together to shape a class of warriors whose shadows still linger in the world today. Imagine standing on a battlefield as arrows blot out the sun, or in a silent garden where a single breath decides the outcome of a duel. This is not just the story of battles won and lost. It is the story of discipline carved into flesh, of love bound by duty, of a people who learned to carry death in their hearts so they might live with unshakable resolve. The tale begins not with a sword drawn, nor with the clash of warriors on a field of battle, but with silence. A silence heavy with incense, silk, and poetry. Picture yourself in Kyoto, in the late Heian period, somewhere around the year 1000. The capital of Japan is a place of shimmering elegance, of courtiers who paint their teeth black and layer their robes like blossoms in spring. Here beauty is power. The emperor's palace gleams with lacquer and gold, filled with whispers of poetry contests, secret liaisons, and endless rituals that govern every flick of a fan, every glance across a screen of painted paper. It is a world where words kill more often than weapons, and the clash of rival families plays out in the dance of politics, not steel. And yet, beneath the surface of this courtly dream, another Japan stirs. A Japan of rice paddies and mountains, where storms rip through valleys and farmers toil beneath a merciless sun. Far from the silken sleeves of the capital, the countryside is wild, untamed, and often lawless. Bandits roam the roads, pirates raid the coasts, and peasants who tend the land must guard it with whatever tools they can wield. Out here, beauty does not protect you. A bow does. A blade does. This is where the samurai are born. The word itself, sabirao, later samurai, means to serve. But in these early days, it is not yet the name of a noble class. It is a verb, an act, a calling, to serve those whose power is fragile, to guard the lives and lands of nobles too refined to soil their hands with blood. At first, these warriors are simply armed retainers, men hired to patrol the estates of aristocrats. They are not yet bound by the codes of Bushidō, nor by the myths that would later define them. They are men of the frontier, men who fight because fighting is needed. Imagine it. The court in Kyoto commands vast stretches of land, but cannot reach them. Powerful families like the Fujiwara grow rich by managing estates granted by the emperor, and these estates, shown, spread across the provinces. From them flows the wealth that sustains the elegance of court life. But estates are vulnerable. Rival clans contest them, peasants rebel, raiders descend from mountain passes. And so, families begin to hire local strongmen, mounted fighters, archers who can protect rice fields, villages, and roads. Over time, these men form bands bound by loyalty not to the emperor in his distant palace, but to the lords who feed them. These fighters are rough, practical, and often more feared than admired. They wear simple armor made of hardened leather and iron plates laced with silk cords. They wield longbows taller than a man, able to send arrows across vast distances with deadly precision. Swords exist, but the bow is king. A mounted archer is the most formidable warrior of the day. Picture them riding through fields at dawn, their horses' hooves drumming against the earth, arrows singing through the air, an early symphony of war. The Heian courtiers in Kyoto may write poems about the moon reflected in a sake cup, but in the provinces, poems are sung in a different language. The war cries of clans, the thrum of bowstrings, the clash of spears. The earliest names of samurai families begin to appear here. The Taira, descended from emperors but hardened in the provinces. The Minamoto, another imperial offshoot, scattered across the eastern lands. These families, aristocratic by blood but warrior by necessity, grow into something new. They embody the duality of Japan itself, silk and steel, poetry and war. Step with me now into the 12th century. You hear the bells of monasteries, the laughter of children chasing dragonflies in the rice fields, the creak of ox carts carrying taxed rice to the capital. But you also hear something darker, the mustering of men, the sharpening of weapons. Tension grows between the warrior clans, who are no longer content to serve. They want power. Real power. The court in Kyoto, decadent and distracted, cannot control them. Civil wars break out, first small then vast. And in this crucible of blood, the samurai transform. No longer merely retainers, they become clans. They become lords of war. The Genpei War of 1180 to 1185 erupts like a thunderstorm, drenching the land in chaos. On one side, the Taira, who have woven themselves into the fabric of Kyoto's court, controlling emperors and dominating politics. On the other, the Minamoto, exiled, vengeful, and hardened by life on the frontier. Their struggle is not just for dominance of the provinces, but for the soul of Japan itself. Imagine yourself at the Battle of Uji in 1180, standing on the banks of a river swollen with summer rains. Minamoto no Yorimasa, an old warrior, leads his men against the Taira. Arrows darken the sky. Horses scream as they plunge into the river, men fighting to cross while enemies hack at them with blades. Yorimasa, knowing defeat is near, chooses death by his own hand rather than capture, the first recorded instance of seppuku, the ritual suicide that will become a hallmark of samurai honor. The river runs red, and with it, a new code is written in blood. From Uji to the final clash at Dan no Yura in 1185, the Genpei War burns across the land. At Dan no Yura, on the restless waters of the Shimonoseki Strait, the Minamoto and Taira fleets collide. Imagine the sea roiling with ships, arrows whistling from deck to deck, men plunging into the waves clad in armor that drags them to the depths. The Taira, carrying the young Emperor Antoku, are annihilated. The boy emperor drowns, cradled by his grandmother, as she leaps into the sea. The Taira vanish beneath the waves, and the Minamoto rise triumphant. From this storm emerges Minamoto no Yoritomo, who establishes the Kamakura shogunate, the first military government of Japan. The emperor remains in Kyoto, but his power is hollow. True rule now belongs to the warrior. And with it, the samurai step into history as more than hired swords. They are the backbone of a new order, a society ruled not by courtiers with ink-stained sleeves, but by men who live and die by the bow and the blade. Think of what this means. 1,000 years of Japan's history has just turned. The samurai, once mere servants, have become rulers. The word samurai is no longer a verb. It is a class, an identity, a destiny. And yet, remember this, at their heart, they remain what they always were, those who serve. Serve their lord, their clan, their code, and eventually, the ideal of honor itself. The path of the samurai has begun. And we, walking beside them, have only taken our first step. The rivers of the Genpei War have run red, and the echoes of Dan no Yura still crash against the shores. The Minamoto have triumphed, and Japan now bows before a new kind of power, not the distant, ceremonial emperor in Kyoto, but the shogun in Kamakura, armored and austere. The samurai have stepped from the margins into the very heart of rule. And yet, victory alone does not define them. A sword can conquer, yes, but what sustains a class of warriors through centuries? What binds them not just as fighters but as a people apart, carrying their own ethos like a flame across time? This is the moment when the samurai begin to shape not only their weapons, but their way. The Heian age had birthed them out of necessity, but the Kamakura age demanded something greater, order. Without it, Japan might dissolve into endless clan wars, its mountains echoing forever with the cries of battle. The warriors who now ruled could not remain mere brawlers. They needed discipline. They needed a creed. And so, slowly, the idea we now call Bushidō, the way of the warrior, began to stir. Bushidō was never written in a single book, never decreed by a single man. It grew like a pine tree, nodding its branches over centuries, shaped by storm and sun alike. In its earliest form, it was simple: loyalty to one's lord, courage in battle, honor above life. But as time passed, it drew from deeper wells, from the ethics of Confucianism, which prized hierarchy and duty, from the rituals of Shinto, with its reverence for purity and ancestors, and from the stillness of Buddhism, especially Zen, which taught the warrior how to still the mind even as chaos raged around him. Imagine standing in Kamakura in the 13th century. The city is rougher than Kyoto, less adorned with lacquer and poetry, more bristling with the smell of salt and sweat. The sea crashes nearby, and the streets are filled not with courtiers in embroidered robes but with men in armor, retainers carrying messages, monks wandering with begging bowls. The shogunate is a government of warriors, and it must shape warriors into something greater than hired killers. Step into the training hall of a samurai youth. The boy is perhaps 7 years old, his head shaved in part, his small hands already gripping a bow as tall as he is. His teacher does not begin with killing blows. He begins with posture, with breathing, with obedience. The boy learns that to draw the bow is not only to kill, but to honor his family, his ancestors, his lord. Every act is infused with meaning. Every failure brings shame not only on himself but on all who stand behind him. Here lies the seed of Bushidō, the belief that a samurai is never alone. He carries within him his clan, his lord, and even the spirits of those who came before. To lie dishonorably is to betray them all. But what is honor? The answer is complex, shifting, sometimes cruel. In the Kamakura age, honor is tied above all to loyalty. The Gokunin, the housemen of the shogun, swear service to their daimyo lords. They ride when called, they fight when ordered, and in return they are granted land, wealth, and protection. But to betray that bond is worse than death. Imagine the weight of it, a man's entire life, his family's survival, bound to his lord's fate. If the daimyo falls, the samurai falls with him. If the daimyo commands death, the samurai must embrace it without hesitation. This bond is iron, and it forges the identity of the warrior more deeply than steel forges a blade. And yet, Bushidō is not only about obedience. It whispers also of courage, not the reckless kind that throws life away for nothing, but the tempered courage that holds steady even when the world shatters. A samurai must be ready to die, but also to live rightly, which can be harder. Death becomes not something to fear but something to master. You can almost hear the words murmured in a Kamakura dojo. To be prepared for death at every moment, that is the way of the warrior. It is a terrifying ideal, and yet also freeing. If death is always accepted, then fear loses its grip. The warrior may walk calmly into fire, into arrows, into the abyss itself. But there is still more. Bushidō is also shaped by the brush as well as the blade. Samurai are taught not only to fight but to write, to compose poetry, to arrange flowers, to practice calligraphy. Why? Because to master the sword alone is to become a brute. To master the arts is to master the self. In the stillness of painting ink on silk, the warrior learns the same discipline he must wield on the battlefield. In the curve of a poem, he finds the same fleeting beauty he must be ready to die for. Thus, Bushidō grows into a paradox, a creed of warriors who are also poets, of men who can slit a throat at dawn and write a haiku at dusk about the sound of frogs leaping into a pond. It is this paradox that gives them their aura, their mystique. Consider, too, the role of religion. Shinto binds the samurai to the land, to the kami spirits that inhabit mountains, rivers, and ancestral shrines. Confucianism teaches him his place in the web of loyalty, from son to father, vassal to lord, man to emperor. Buddhism, especially Zen, whispers of impermanence, of the emptiness of self. The samurai learns that all things are fleeting, that death is but a moment in an endless cycle. To fight with such beliefs is to fight with serenity, even amid carnage. This is why the samurai begin to meditate, to rake gardens of gravel and moss, to seek clarity not only in steel but in silence. Imagine a warrior kneeling in a Zen temple after battle, his armor still stained with blood, his sword resting beside him. Around him, incense coils into the rafters. Before him, a monk strikes a bell that echoes like eternity. In that stillness, the warrior breathes, and in breathing, he finds the strength to carry both the killing and the sorrow that come with his path. Bushido is not yet codified, not yet the written codes of later centuries, but here in the Kamakura age its roots are laid. And those roots will sink deep, twisting through centuries of war and peace alike. You and I can already sense where this path leads. From the roar of battle to the hush of temples, from the loyalty of Gokunin to the stoicism of Zen, the samurai are becoming more than soldiers. They are becoming symbols. Their lives, their deaths, their very gestures will be weighed against ideals greater than themselves. And as the Kamakura shogunate grows, as Japan itself hardens under warrior rule, the ideal of Bushido spreads like fire through dry grass. 1,000 boys are taught to bow before their lords, to embrace death, to polish not only their swords but their souls. 1,000 men march into battle believing that even if their bodies fall, their honor will stand immortal. The sword is no longer only steel. It has become spirit. And the spirit has a name: Bushido. The temple bell fades, leaving only silence and the scent of incense. A samurai rises from meditation, his face calm, his eyes unreadable. At his side, resting in its lacquered scabbard, lies the object that binds all his vows, all his discipline, all his destiny. A blade, not yet legend in itself, but already carrying the weight of centuries. For to understand the soul of the samurai, we must follow the path of the sword. The katana was not born whole, not delivered in perfection. Like the samurai themselves, it evolved, shaped by necessity, by blood, and by art. In the earliest days, when mounted archery ruled the field, the sword was not yet the samurai's defining weapon. Warriors favored the tachi, a long, slightly curved sword worn edge down, designed to be drawn while on horseback. Picture the 12th century battlefield, banners flapping in the wind, mounted samurai charging, bows arched, arrows slicing through the air. When the distance closed and arrows ran out, the tachi was drawn, sweeping in wide arcs against enemies. It was a weapon of cavalry, long and heavy, meant to cut down foes in single, decisive strokes. But warfare is a patient teacher, and Japan's wars began to change. Battles shifted from sweeping mounted duels to close, brutal combat on foot. Fortified castles rose across the land, demanding sieges fought in muddy trenches and narrow gates. In this world, the long tachi was unwieldy, slow to draw, ill-suited for tight quarters. Warriors needed a blade quicker, swifter, more intimate. And so, in the crucible of the Kamakura age, the katana emerged. The katana, shorter than the tachi, worn edge up at the waist. This subtle change, this reversal of orientation, transformed everything. Now the warrior could draw and cut in a single, fluid motion, aiajutsu, striking in the heartbeat between peace and violence. Imagine it, a samurai, hand resting lightly on the hilt, bowing in respect. A flicker, a breath, and steel flashes free, slicing through the air before the opponent even registers movement. Speed and precision replaced weight and reach. The katana became not merely a weapon but a statement of philosophy, decisiveness, swiftness, inevitability. Yet the katana was more than function. It was art. Step with me into the forge. The air is hot, heavy with the hiss of coal and the tang of iron. A master swordsmith bends over his anvil, face lit by sparks. Before him lies not yet a blade but a promise. Steel, raw and stubborn, must be coaxed into life. The smith folds it once, twice, 10 times, hammering, heating, quenching. Impurities are beaten out, the grain refined, the edge honed sharper than thought itself. This process is not merely technical. It is ritual, spiritual. Each hammer strike is accompanied by prayer, each quench in water by reverence for the kami spirits said to inhabit the steel. The blade is not forged so much as born, its life shaped by the balance of heat and breath, earth and water, human will and divine favor. The great names of swordsmiths echo through time. Masamune, whose blades were said to embody serenity, sharp yet harmonious, so flawless they could cut without malice. His rival, Muramasa, whose swords bore a darker legend, cursed, bloodthirsty, said to hunger for death. Whether myth or truth, these stories reveal how deeply the Japanese came to believe that a sword held more than steel. It held spirit. A Masamune was not merely sharp, it was righteous. A Muramasa was not merely lethal, it was dangerous, alive, untrustworthy. And so the katana became more than a weapon. It was an extension of the soul. A samurai did not part with his blade. To be stripped of it was to be stripped of honor. To draw it was to risk life itself. Even in peace, the katana hung at the warrior's side, a constant reminder that death was always within reach. Picture a quiet evening in a samurai's home. The day's duties are finished. He sits by lamplight, unfastens his scabbard, and slides the blade free. He wipes it gently with soft rice paper, oils it against rust, examines the curve of its edge under the glow of fire. This is no idle chore. It is communion, like a priest tending the altar. For to neglect the sword is to neglect oneself. To polish the sword is to polish the soul. But the katana was not only sacred in ritual. It was tested in war. At the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, samurai charged against Oda Nobunaga's gun-wielding infantry. Muskets thundered, arrows fell, horses screamed. Amid this storm of fire, those who survived the volleys drew their katanas, clashing in close quarters where gunpowder could not reach. The curved steel sang its sharp song, cutting through armor, through bone. Even as the age of firearms dawned, the katana remained the final word when distance collapsed, when a warrior stood face to face with his fate. Yet the sword was not always drawn. Indeed, one of its greatest powers was in restraint. The presence of a katana at a samurai's side was a deterrent, a silent reminder of his capacity. To draw it lightly was dishonor. To draw it in rage was madness. To draw it only when necessary, that was the mark of true discipline. It was said that the sword contained the spirit of its wielder, but also the spirit of his ancestors. Many families pass blades down through generations, each nick and polish a chapter in their history. A katana was not new when it was forged, it was eternal, a link between past and future. And so, when a samurai knelt to take his life in seppuku, the blade he used was not random steel. It was his companion, his judge, his final witness. The katana saw him born into the path of Bushidō, and it would see him out of it, its edge as merciless as his own code. Thus, steel and spirit entwined. Bushidō taught the samurai how to live and die. The katana gave him the instrument with which to embody both. Together they formed a unity unmatched in history, a weapon that was also a philosophy, a tool that was also a soul. Even now, centuries later, when you picture a samurai, do you see him without his blade? The two cannot be separated. To speak of one is to whisper of the other. The bell that began this path still echoes faintly in the distance, but now it blends with another sound, the ring of steel sliding against its scabbard, the hiss of a perfect cut, the silence after. And so we walk onward, carrying with us the soul of the samurai, knowing that the sword at his side is never only a weapon. It is his mirror, his shadow, his destiny. The katana gleams in lamplight, its edge wiped clean, its spirit tended. A samurai sets it carefully back into its scabbard, as reverently as one might place a relic upon an altar. He breathes deeply, steady, aware that the steel at his side is not merely his own, it is a legacy, and that legacy must be carried forward. Turn your eyes now to the child watching from the corner. His hair is still soft, his frame small, but his gaze burns with fascination. He does not yet understand the full weight of Bushidō, nor the burden of the blade, but he feels it, the presence of expectation pressing down like the first snow of winter. For he is 7, and 7 is the age when childhood ends for the son of a warrior. Training begins. Imagine it, a courtyard swept clean of dust, the morning air cool and sharp. The boy kneels as his father or master speaks, instructing him not first in swordsmanship, but in posture, in bowing, in humility. Before he may touch steel, he must learn respect. He bows to the ancestors, to his teachers, to the spirits that watch unseen. Only then may his hand close around the hilt of a practiced weapon. The first lessons are simple, though they feel monumental to a child. How to hold a wooden sword without strain, how to stand without stumbling, how to breathe with focus. Hours pass in repetition, muscles aching, blisters rising on soft palms. This is the foundation, the grind of discipline laid brick by brick, long before artistry can flourish. By day, he learns the warrior's arts. Archery, Kyujitsu, the great bow, taller than himself, strung with power. He draws until his arms shake, releasing arrows that fall short at first, then gradually strike closer to the mark. The lesson is not only in aim, but in patience, in calm breath, in drawing strength not from muscle alone but from unity of body and mind. Swordsmanship, Kenjutsu, wooden blades clash in endless drills. Strike, block, parry, step. Again. 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 His teacher's voice is relentless, the rhythm of strikes echoing through the yard like a drumbeat. Perfection is distant, but pursuit of it is demanded daily. Horsemanship, the boy is lifted onto a horse, the animal's power terrifying at first, exhilarating later. To master the horse is to master both freedom and fear. He learns to shoot while riding, to balance with the animal's rhythm, to see mount and rider not as two beings but as one. By night, he learns a different set of arts, quieter, but no less essential. His hand holds a brush, painting characters upon paper with black ink. Each stroke is judged, each line a reflection of his spirit. Calligraphy, his teacher explains, is not merely writing, it is discipline in another form, a mirror of the sword's path. A shaky hand, an impatient mind, all are revealed in the lines of ink. He memorizes poetry, too, short verses that capture fleeting beauty, the moon's reflection in water, the cry of a bird in autumn dusk. For a warrior must not only kill, but also perceive. To see beauty in the world is to remember what one protects, and what one may lose. And there is ritual. The tea ceremony, with its careful gestures, its silences that speak louder than words. To serve tea is to practice precision, mindfulness, humility. Each step in the ritual echoes the discipline of combat, teaching the boy that every action, no matter how small, holds meaning. Through this tapestry of training, the child's life is shaped. He does not belong to himself alone, he belongs to his family, his lord, his clan. He learns that his body is a vessel for service, his mind a tool for loyalty. The training is not without cruelty. Punishments for disobedience are harsh, for a mistake in peace could mean death in war. The boy learns to accept pain without flinching, to rise after falling, to bow after failure and begin again. Tears are swallowed, weakness concealed. From the earliest years, he is taught that a warrior must endure, for to falter is to dishonor not only himself but all who came before. And yet there is also pride. Imagine the glow in his chest the first time his arrow strikes true, the first time his master nods silently at a cut well made. Imagine the thrill of galloping across a field, hair flying, bow in hand, the world opening before him. These moments of triumph plant seeds of confidence that will carry him through darker days. As he grows, the training deepens. He learns strategy, the art of reading the battlefield, the stories of great generals before him. He studies Chinese classics, Confucian texts that speak of duty and order. He listens to monks who whisper of impermanence, of death as no more than a passing cloud. Slowly, the boy becomes more than a child drilled in drills. He becomes a vessel of philosophy, carrying within him the codes that will govern his life. But always, at his side, the sword waits. First wooden, then steel, finally a katana forged to fit his hand. To receive such a blade is not only a gift, but a rite of passage. The moment it is placed in his care, he ceases to be merely a boy in training. He becomes samurai. This cycle repeats across generations. Fathers teach sons, masters shape apprentices, and the path of Bushidō flows forward unbroken. In every household, across provinces and centuries, the sound of practice echoes, the slap of arrows against targets, the clash of wooden swords, the murmur of poetry, the hiss of brushes across paper. It is a chorus, 1,000 voices singing the same song of discipline and duty. And through it all, the samurai child grows into the samurai man. The boy who once stumbled with a bow becomes the warrior who stands unflinching before arrows. The child who once trembled on horseback becomes the rider who charges into battle without fear. The youth who once spilled ink in shaky calligraphy becomes the man who writes death poems before going to war. This is how the samurai are made. Not in the moment of battle, not in the instant of death, but in the long years of training from childhood. The soul is hammered as surely as steel, folded again and again until impurity is driven out, until what remains is sharp, resilient, unyielding. And so, the child bows once more at dawn, rises, and takes his place upon the path. A path begun centuries before him, a path that will stretch centuries after. A path called Bushidō, the way of the warrior. The morning sun rises over fields of rice, glinting across helmets polished the night before. A retainer mounts his horse, the lacquered crest of his clan tied proudly to his back. He does not ride for himself. He does not ride for his family alone. He rides because his lord has summoned him, and to answer that summons is not a choice. It is life itself. For the samurai is not free. He is a man tied by bonds of fealty, woven into a net of loyalty and obligation that defines his very existence. To serve is the essence of his being, and the daimyo, the great land-holding lords of medieval Japan, are the suns around which these warriors orbit. To understand the samurai, one must understand this bond. It is not merely political. It is spiritual. The Kamakura period had already planted the seeds of this order. When Minamoto no Yoritomo created the system of Gokunin, the house men, sworn to serve him as shogun. These men were not mere mercenaries. They were bound by oaths to rise at their lord's command, to fight in his wars, to defend his lands. In return, they received estates, protection, and above all, the honor of service itself. The contract was written not only in ink, but in blood. Picture the ceremony of swearing fealty. A samurai kneels before his daimyo, head bowed, hands folded. Before him lies a sacred object, perhaps a shrine relic, perhaps the ancestral sword of the clan. He speaks words of loyalty, pledging to follow his lord in all things, to live and die at his command. The daimyo, in turn, promises protection and reward. The air is heavy with incense, the silence broken only by the crackle of a torch. From that moment on, the samurai's fate is no longer his own. Service is not merely military. A daimyo's retainer guards his household, escorts his wife, defends his castle walls, ensures the safety of his messengers on dangerous roads. He attends his lord at banquets, rides behind him in processions, carries his banner into battle. Every gesture of loyalty is visible, every act a reaffirmation of the bond. But loyalty is not always simple. What happens when two obligations clash? When a samurai's family is endangered but his lord commands him elsewhere? When his conscience whispers one truth and his daimyo demands another? Such conflicts lie at the heart of countless tales. Consider the story of Kusunoki Masashige, a samurai of the 14th century. Loyal to Emperor Go-Daigo, Kusunoki was ordered to defend a hopeless position against overwhelming shogunate forces. Knowing the battle meant certain death, he obeyed nonetheless. His small force was crushed, and he fell in battle, but his loyalty became legend. To this day, statues of Kusunoki stand near the imperial palace in Tokyo, a reminder that service, even unto death, could outlast victory itself. Service to the daimyo could be noble. It could also be dangerous, even fatal. A samurai's fortunes rose and fell with his lord's. Should the daimyo prosper, his retainers were rewarded with land, titles, and wealth. Should he falter, they too would be dragged into ruin. To betray one's lord was unforgivable. To abandon him in defeat was shame itself. And so, when a daimyo was forced to commit suicide, his samurai often followed him into death, either by battle or by their own blades. This phenomenon, later known as junshin, following in death, was considered the ultimate proof of loyalty. And yet service was not blind. The daimyo relied upon their retainers not merely as warriors but as advisors, governors, and stewards of their lands. A trusted samurai might be asked to manage an estate, collect taxes, enforce laws, or even act as judge over disputes. In these roles, he wielded not the sword but the brush, demonstrating that loyalty demanded not only strength but wisdom. In castles across Japan, you can almost hear the murmur of such men at work, scribes copying records by lamplight, retainers advising their daimyo in war councils, guards patrolling the wooden corridors with steady steps. The samurai was never idle, for his lord's needs were endless. But service also demanded sacrifice. A samurai's family might be sent as hostages to ensure loyalty. His lands might be confiscated if suspicion of betrayal arose. His entire existence could be reshaped by his lord's whims. Imagine the weight of living in such constant uncertainty. To know that your home, your wife, even your children could be demanded of you as proof of faith. Still, for the samurai, service was pride. To serve a powerful daimyo was to walk in his shadow and bask in his glory. To ride at the front of his army was to write one's name into history. Service gave meaning, even if it also carried chains. This bond of fealty would shape Japan for centuries, tying men into networks of obligation that could topple kingdoms and ignite wars. When daimyo clashed, their samurai clashed with them, bound not by personal quarrel but by the inescapable demands of loyalty. Service created armies, armies created wars, and wars forged legends. The path we walk has brought us here, from childhood training to adult service, from personal discipline to feudal obligation. The samurai, who once stood as solitary warriors, now stand as threads in a vast tapestry of lordship and loyalty. Each daimyo is a pillar, and around him, dozens, hundreds, even thousands of retainers move like shadows, ready to draw their swords at his word. And yet, in every bow before a lord's dais, there lingers a question: does loyalty make a man noble, or does it make him a servant chained to another's will? The samurai of Japan lived that question every day. Some answered with honor, others with betrayal. But all carried its weight until their final breath. And so we step forward again, following those retainers as they march at their lord's command, banners snapping in the wind, hoofs thundering against the earth. The daimyo calls. The samurai answer. And Japan marches into war. The banners snap in the wind, crests painted in bold strokes, red suns, white fans, black feathers. Hooves drum the earth as lines of mounted warriors advance, their armor clattering like iron rain. At their center rides the daimyo, stern and commanding. Around him gather his retainers, each one bound by oath, each one carrying the weight of his family, his clan, his ancestors. The samurai are no longer boys in training yards, no longer retainers in quiet castles. They are now soldiers of war. And war, in medieval Japan, is not only a contest of steel but a crucible where loyalty, honor, and survival burn together into legend. The Genpei War, 1180 to 1185, is our entry point, the storm that transforms Japan forever. Two families, both descended from emperors, rise in bitter rivalry, the Taira and the Minamoto. The Taira hold sway in Kyoto, draped in silk and power, their influence woven into the very heart of the court. The Minamoto, exiled, hardened in the rough eastern provinces, bide their time. The conflict is more than personal. It is dynastic, national, cosmic in its reach. Imagine standing at the banks of the Uji River in 1180. The water runs fast, swollen by rains, a barrier between the Taira and the Minamoto. On one side, Minamoto no Yorimasa, gray-haired yet unbroken, rallies his men. On the other, Taira warriors advance, eager to crush the rebellion. The Minamoto destroy the bridge, leaving only the torrent as a shield. But the Taira are relentless. Horses plunge into the river, men swimming with swords strapped to their backs. Arrows fall like rain. Yorimasa, wounded and knowing defeat is certain, chooses not to be captured. Kneeling beneath a tree, he composes a death poem and drives his blade into his belly, the first recorded seppuku in history. His death sets the tone for generations to come. Better to die with honor than live in shame. The war spreads, sweeping through valleys and mountains, leaving trails of ash and blood. At Ichinatani in 1184, the Minamoto launch a daring attack down steep cliffs, horses thundering down slopes thought impassable. The Taira, taken by surprise, are routed. The image of cavalry descending from the heights becomes one of the enduring scenes of samurai audacity, victory snatched not by numbers, but by boldness. And then the climax, Dan no Yura, 1185. A naval battle on the swirling waters of the Shimonoseki Strait. Picture hundreds of ships locked together, banners flapping, arrows whistling across the waves. The young Emperor Antoku, only 6 years old, sits aboard a Taira vessel, guarded by his grandmother. As the tide shifts, the Taira fleet falters. One by one, their ships are overwhelmed. Realizing all is lost, the grandmother takes the boy emperor in her arms and leaps into the sea, drowning rather than submitting. The waters close over them, and with their fall, the Taira clan is extinguished. The Minamoto emerge victorious. Minamoto no Yoritomo establishes the Kamakura shogunate, a military government that strips the emperor of real power. The samurai, forged in war, are now rulers of Japan. But the Genpei War is only the beginning. Across centuries, Japan will echo with the clash of samurai armies. Each age brings its own wars, its own heroes, its own tragedies. In the 13th century, the Mongols arrive, thunder from the west, horsemen who had swept across continents. Twice they land upon Japanese shores, in 1274 and 1281. Samurai gather to defend the coast, facing an enemy unlike any they had known, foreign soldiers wielding catapults, fire arrows, and weapons of strange design. The battles rage on beaches and in stormy seas. Both invasions end not in Japanese defeat, but in typhoons, the kamikaze. Divine winds that scatter the Mongol fleets. The storms are hailed as heaven's protection, yet the battles leave scars. Samurai learn that the world is larger than their islands, and that war can come from beyond the horizon. Later still, the Sengoku Jidai, the Warring States period, from 1467 to 1600, plunges the land into near-constant conflict. Daimyo rise and fall like waves upon the shore, each seeking to unify Japan under his banner. Samurai march by the tens of thousands, their battles sprawling across plains, mountains, and rivers. Castles rise in stone and timber, war drums echo through valleys, villages burn as armies clash. It is an age of endless campaigning, where loyalty is tested daily and betrayal lurks in every shadow. Imagine the battlefield of Kawanakajima in the mid-16th century, where Takeda Shingen and Yasuji Kenshin, two titanic warlords, clash 5 times in desperate struggle. At one point, Kenshin himself charges through the melee, striking directly at Shingen, who deflects the blow with his iron war fan. Such moments blur the line between myth and history, yet they capture the spirit of the age. Leaders as warriors, warriors as leaders, locked in mortal combat for dominance. In these wars, the samurai's role evolves. Archery, once the heart of combat, gives way to the sword, the spear, and eventually firearms. Yet always, in the heart of the storm, the samurai embody the same code: loyalty, courage, readiness to die. Consider the way they fought. Before battles, samurai would often announce their names, declaring their lineage and deeds to the enemy. Duels could erupt amid the chaos, each warrior seeking glory as much as victory. Heads were taken as trophies, proof of valor to be displayed before lords. War was not only survival, it was theater, ritual, a stage upon which honor was tested and reputations forged. And yet, war was also cruel. Villages burned, peasants starved, entire families were annihilated in the sweep of armies. For the samurai, glory and horror were inseparable, each cut of the blade carrying both. Through it all, the image of the samurai in war endures, armored figures with crested helmets, faces masked in iron, banners fluttering, blades gleaming. They charge into storms of arrows, stand firm against tides of enemies, fall with dignity when defeat is certain. Their wars carved Japan's history as surely as rivers carve valleys. From the Genpei War to the Mongol invasions, from the endless strife of the Sengoku Jidai to the unification under Tokugawa, the samurai remain the constant. Their loyalty binds them, their discipline steadies them, their code defines them. And when the battle smoke clears, whether in victory or in ruin, their names live on in song and story. The samurai in war are more than soldiers. They are actors in a grand drama of blood and destiny, their lives woven into the fabric of Japan. To ride with them is to feel the thunder of hooves, the sting of arrows, the silence of death, poems whispered before a final charge. And as we leave the battlefield now, stepping through the haze of smoke and the cries of the wounded, we carry with us a truth. War was not only where the samurai proved themselves, it was where they defined themselves. The battlefield lies silent now. The banners that once whipped in the wind lie trampled in the mud. Crows gather. The cries of the wounded fade into groans, then into nothing. And in that silence, a figure kneels. His armor is broken, his men scattered, his lord defeated. Yet his face is calm, his movements deliberate. Before him rests not an enemy, but his own blade, glinting faintly in the dying light. This is where honor demands its final proof. For the samurai, death was never only the end of life. It was a stage, a ritual, a canvas upon which the meaning of existence was painted in blood. Seppuku, ritual self-disembowelment, was the act by which a warrior could reclaim control when all else was lost. To fall to an enemy's hand was shame. To flee was dishonor. But to kneel, to bare the belly, to drive steel into flesh with one's own hands, that was dignity. That was loyalty made eternal. The roots of seppuku stretch back to the earliest wars of the samurai. We have already walked past the moment in 1180 when Minamoto no Yorimasa, cornered at the Battle of Uji, became the first recorded samurai to take his life in this way. Wounded and unwilling to be captured by the Taira, he composed a death poem and thrust his blade into his abdomen beneath a pine tree. His retainer then delivered the Kaishakunin strike, a merciful decapitation to end his suffering. Yorimasa's choice became legend, echoing through centuries as the model of how a warrior should meet defeat. Over time, this act hardened into ritual. By the Kamakura and Muromachi periods, seppuku was codified, with steps, expectations, and even choreography. A warrior preparing for this death would dress in white robes, the color of purity. He would compose his Jisei no Ku, a death poem, brief and profound, capturing the fleeting beauty of life. He would kneel upon tatami mats, a short blade, a tanto or wakizashi, placed before him. At his side stood the kaishakunin, often a trusted friend or retainer. This man's role was crucial. When the warrior made the cut across his belly, spilling his life into the world, the kaishakunin's duty was to end his agony with a swift stroke to the neck. The timing demanded skill, precision, and compassion. To strike too early was insult. To strike too late was cruelty. To strike perfectly was to honor the fallen. The act itself was both horrifying and sacred. Imagine the silence in the chamber, broken only by the rasp of steel sliding from its scabbard. The samurai takes the blade in both hands, presses it to his abdomen, and cuts, first left, then right, sometimes upward to form a cross. His breath hitches. His blood spills dark upon the mats. His face remains calm, or strives to. A final poem lingers on his lips. And then, with one clean stroke, the kaishakunin severs the head. The body falls forward, the soul released. This is no mere suicide. It is performance, ritual, offering. It is the samurai's last act of service, his final display of discipline. To endure the unbearable without flinching, that is the essence of Bushidō. Seppuku could take many forms. There was the battlefield seppuku, sudden and unadorned, as when defeat was certain and capture loomed. There was the judicial seppuku, ordered as punishment by a lord or shogunate. In such cases, the condemned samurai was granted the honor of taking his own life rather than being executed like a criminal. There was also voluntary seppuku, undertaken to protest injustice, to atone for failure, or to demonstrate loyalty after a lord's death. Each variation was bound by the same principle. To die by one's own hand was to claim agency in the face of defeat. The most famous tale of seppuku is perhaps that of the 47 Ronin. In 1703, after avenging the death of their lord, these masterless samurai surrendered themselves to justice. The shogunate ordered their execution, but granted them the dignity of seppuku. One by one they knelt, cut, and fell, their loyalty enshrined forever in story and song. To this day, their graves at Sengakuji Temple are visited by pilgrims, a testament to the enduring power of death embraced with honor. And yet, let us not be too swift to romanticize. For all its ceremony, seppuku was also brutal, bloody, excruciating. The human body does not yield easily to the blade. Even with the mercy strike, pain was unavoidable, suffering inevitable. To watch such a death was to be reminded of the fragility of flesh, the cruelty of steel. But perhaps that was the point. Bushidō demanded that a warrior confront death directly, without illusion, without escape. Seppuku stripped away pretense, leaving only raw courage. Consider also the family of the man who died. His wife, his children, his household, all bore the weight of his choice. A lord might honor them with land or titles, but just as often they were left adrift, their protector gone. The samurai's noble death could be another's endless hardship. Yet still, the act was revered. For the warrior, his own honor outweighed all else. There is something haunting in this, the way dignity was measured not by how one lived, but how one died. The samurai's training from childhood, his years of service, his deeds in battle, all could be overshadowed by a single act of cowardice or dishonor. And so, seppuku stood as both shield and sentence, the ultimate means of proving loyalty even when all else was lost. Imagine yourself in that chamber, kneeling upon the mats as the warrior bows one final time. You smell the incense, see the flicker of torchlight upon the blade. You hear the hush of breath as steel meets flesh, the thud of the final strike. And then silence. A silence heavier than any battlefield, a silence that lingers long after the blood has dried. This is the silence of honor, of sacrifice, of an ending chosen rather than imposed. From battlefields to tatami chambers, from Yorimasa beneath the pine to the 47 Ronin, the ritual of seppuku winds through the history of the samurai like a red thread. It is brutal, tragic, sublime. It is the essence of Bushidō distilled into one final act: death before dishonor, loyalty beyond life. And as we step from that chamber now, leaving the white robes behind, our path leads us toward another truth. The samurai were not only men. Women, too, bore the sword, stood in defense of castles, and sometimes chose the same path of honor. Their story waits just beyond this silence. The image of the samurai has long been painted as male, armored figures with stern faces, riding into battle beneath their lord's banner. But look closer, and you will find other figures standing in the shadows of this tale, women who, when duty called, put aside the role of nurturer and took up the mantle of the warrior. In the wooden halls of a samurai household, a daughter grew up hearing the same whispers of honor as her brother. She was taught to manage the home, to serve tea, to compose poems, yes. But alongside this, she was handed a weapon, the naginata. A polearm with a curved blade at its tip, the naginata became the symbol of women's martial skill. Its long reach allowed a woman to keep distance from an enemy, to cut down a mounted attacker, to fight even against stronger foes. For centuries, Japanese women trained with this weapon, not as ornament, but as necessity. Imagine her in the courtyard at dawn, her hair tied back, her stance firm. With each sweep of the naginata, the blade whistles through the air. She strikes, withdraws, pivots, strikes again, fluid as a dance, deadly as the storm. The weapon becomes not merely a tool of defense but an extension of her body, her will, her place in a world where war often came to the very threshold of her home. The most famous of these women was Tomoe, a name spoken with reverence even 8 centuries later. She fought in the Genpei War of the late 12th century, serving Minamoto no Yashinaka. Chroniclers describe her as a warrior of surpassing beauty and extraordinary valor. At the Battle of Awazu in 1184, she rode into combat clad in armor, long black hair flowing, bow and sword at her side. She fought as fiercely as any man, unhorsing enemies, taking heads as trophies. One tale tells of her single-handedly seizing an enemy warrior and tearing him from his horse, a feat of sheer strength. When Yashinaka's forces were overwhelmed, Tomoe fought until ordered to withdraw. Her fate is uncertain. Some say she became a nun, others that she lived quietly, her glory fading into legend. But in the stories, she remains immortal, the warrior woman who stood beside men and proved herself their equal. And Tomoe was not alone. Across the centuries, women took up arms to defend their clans and castles. In the Sengoku Jidai, the warring states period of the 15th and 16th centuries, war was constant. Daimyo clashed, villages burned, and castles became both home and battlefield. When men marched to war, women often remained behind the walls, not only to guard children and provisions but to lead defenses when attackers struck. One such woman was Nakano Takiko, who lived much later, during the upheaval of the Bashin War in 1868. Though technically beyond the age of the medieval samurai, her spirit was their direct descendant. When imperial forces besieged Eizu, Takiko led a unit of women, the Joshitai, or Women's Army, armed with naginata. She fought at the front, striking down enemies until she was fatally shot. Before dying, she asked her sister to sever her head so it would not fall into enemy hands, echoing the same grim honor that men practiced through seppuku. Her grave still stands, visited by those who honor her courage. But between Tomoe and Takiko lie countless unnamed women who defended hearth and home. Chronicles tell of women standing atop castle walls, raining arrows upon besiegers, pouring boiling water or stones upon enemies who tried to scale the ramparts. Others took their children on their backs, sword in hand, fighting until the last breath. Yet their role was not always with steel in hand. Women were often the glue that bound warrior households. They managed estates when men were away, negotiated alliances through marriage, and taught their sons and daughters the values of discipline and duty. In times of peace, they were poets and calligraphers. In times of war, they were soldiers. The duality defined them as much as it defined the men of their world. The presence of Anabu-geisha also shaped how femininity was imagined in Japan. While the Confucian ideals imported from China emphasized obedience and domesticity, the Japanese reality left space for women to be both gentle and martial. A woman might serve tea with grace one day and take up the naginata the next. Strength and softness were not opposites, but complements. Consider the ritual training of young women in samurai families. Just as boys practiced archery and horseback riding, girls were often taught the handling of the naginata and the dagger called kaiken, kept close in their sleeves. The kaiken served a grim purpose. If a woman faced capture, she could use it to end her own life, preserving her honor as surely as a man might through seppuku. In this, too, their path mirrored the men's, different in form, but united in principle. When you walk through the quiet corridors of history, it is easy to hear only the footsteps of men. But listen more closely, and you hear the echo of other steps, lighter, but no less resolute. Steps that carried women across castle courtyards, up the steps of watchtowers, onto battlefields where they were never expected but always feared once they appeared. The image of the samurai is incomplete without them. The soul of the warrior was not bound to gender, but to loyalty, courage, and readiness to die for honor. Tomo Guzan proved it at Owazu. Nakano Takiko proved it at Eizu. And countless others proved it in moments history did not preserve, but which live still in the silence between the chronicles. So let us walk on, carrying not only the image of men in armor but also the vision of women with naginata in hand, standing at the gates of burning castles, eyes fierce, hearts unyielding. The samurai spirit was not only his. It was hers as well. And as we leave the shadow of those castle walls, our path leads us toward another truth, that beyond sword and naginata, beyond war itself, the samurai spirit was shaped by something quieter, deeper, the stillness of meditation, the discipline of Zen. That is where our steps now carry us. Imagine a warrior seated cross-legged on a polished wooden floor. His armor has been set aside. Before him burns a single stick of incense, the smoke rising in a slow, curling line. His sword rests nearby, but his hands are folded, his eyes half closed. The only sound is his breath, steady and even. This, too, is the training of a samurai, not of muscle or steel, but of mind. When Zen Buddhism entered Japan from China in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, it found fertile ground among the newly risen samurai class. The old aristocracy of Kyoto had embraced other Buddhist sects, with their elaborate rituals, chanting, and gilded halls. But the warriors, hardened by battle, hungered for something simpler, starker, closer to the edge of life and death. Zen offered precisely that: discipline, clarity, the stripping away of excess until only essence remained. The principles of Zen spoke directly to the samurai condition. Life was impermanent. Death could arrive in an instant. To cling to fear or hesitation was folly. Through meditation, the samurai sought mushin, no mind, a state where thought and action were one, where hesitation vanished, where the sword moved as naturally as breath. Picture the training hall. A master strikes without warning. The student must respond instantly, not pausing to think, not lost in doubt. Too slow, and he falls. But in Mushin, the body moves of its own accord, free of the clutter of conscious thought. For the warrior, this was not philosophy alone. It was survival. On the battlefield, a single heartbeat of hesitation could mean death. Zen honed the mind until it mirrored the blade, sharp, unyielding, utterly present. Zen also shaped the way samurai saw beauty. Where the courtly aristocrats adored ornament and luxury, Zen taught appreciation of the simple and imperfect. The weathered rock, the withered branch, the silence between notes in music. Samurai, trained to face mortality, found solace in these teachings. A single falling leaf became a reminder of life's transience. A bowl cracked and mended with gold, kintsugi, embodied the truth that imperfection was not flaw but essence. In the stillness of Zen gardens, with their raked gravel and solitary stones, samurai found mirrors of their own minds. Order within simplicity. Motion within stillness. Each stone placed with purpose, each line of sand a reflection of discipline. To walk such a garden was to walk inward, toward calm. And from Zen came practices that permeated the warrior's life. The tea ceremony, formalized by masters like Sen no Rikyu, was steeped in Zen ideals. Every gesture was precise, every silence intentional. For the samurai, to serve or to drink tea was to practice the same mindfulness he carried into battle. The ceremony taught humility. Even the mightiest daimyo would kneel in a small tea room, stripped of rank, sharing bowls with retainers as equals. It was, in its way, another form of combat, not with blades, but with ego. Zen calligraphy and ink painting, too, found favor among the warrior class. The stroke of a brush, swift and irreversible, mirrored the stroke of a sword. One line, one chance, hesitation or error could not be undone. A samurai who practiced calligraphy was not merely writing, he was honing the same focus he needed in combat. Even the act of composing death poems, Jisei no ku, before battle or ritual suicide was infused with Zen. Warriors captured the impermanence of existence in a handful of syllables. The moon behind clouds, the cry of a bird, the withering of autumn grass. These verses were not written for others but for oneself, final meditations that transformed fear into clarity. Consider the words of one samurai who, on the eve of death, wrote, "Like dewdrops on grass, life gently slips away. A moment, no more." In such lines we glimpse the fusion of steel and silence, of war and wisdom. The influence of Zen was not confined to the battlefield or the meditation hall. It shaped architecture, austere temples of wood and stone, uncluttered and serene. It shaped diet, meals simple, frugal, nourishing without indulgence. It even shaped swordsmanship schools, where duels were seen not only as contests of skill but as expressions of inner truth. Miyamoto Musashi, the famed duelist and strategist of the 17th century, exemplified this union of Zen and sword. In his Book of Five Rings, he wrote of combat not merely in terms of tactics but of mind, emptiness, flow, readiness without attachment. His life of wandering, his disdain for luxury, his endless pursuit of mastery all bore the mark of Zen thought. Yet Zen was not only about serenity. It was about facing reality unflinching, stripping away illusions. For the samurai, this meant acknowledging death not as tragedy but as constant companion. In meditation halls, they contemplated skulls, bones, the decay of flesh. Not to despair, but to accept. Death was inevitable. To fear it was weakness. To embrace it was freedom. Imagine yourself now in a dimly lit zendo. The floor creaks as you kneel. The master paces behind with a thin rod, striking the shoulder of those who drift into drowsiness. Your legs ache, your mind wanders, yet you return again and again to the breath. Inhale. Exhale. The world narrows until nothing remains but the present moment. In this, you taste what the samurai sought, the ability to stand in battle as calmly as in meditation, to accept death as readily as life. Zen gave the samurai a way to live with the burden of their existence. It offered peace amid violence, clarity amid chaos, meaning amid impermanence. It was the silent partner to the roar of war, the calm heartbeat beneath the thunder of hoofs. And so, as we step out of the zendo, past the raked gravel gardens, past the ink scrolls and tea bowls, we see how deeply Zen seeped into the warrior's soul. Without it, the samurai might have been only killers. With it, They became something more, men and women, who sought harmony even as they waged war, who found beauty even as they faced death. But the samurai were not monks. They carried swords, led armies, wielded power. And in times of peace, when their blades were sheathed, they turned to other pursuits: poetry, drama, ceremony, where the spirit of Bushido mingled with art itself. It is there our path now leads. For the samurai were never only men of war. They were also men and women of culture. And so now we move gently, as if crossing from a temple into a theater, from the still hush of meditation into the vibrant yet restrained world of art. Picture a samurai in full armor, his helmet crowned with antlers, his mask fierce, his sword stained with battle. Now picture that same man, seated in a quiet chamber lit by a single lantern, brush in hand, ink flowing across paper as he composes a verse about the cry of a cicada in summer. This is no contradiction. This is the duality of the warrior. The arts were not a distraction from the way of the samurai. They were its completion. To wield the sword with precision, one must also learn to wield silence, rhythm, and beauty. In this, poetry, drama, and ceremony became as much a part of Bushido as armor and steel. Poetry was central. From the Heian period onward, verse was the mark of a refined spirit. Samurai families, wishing to assert not only power but culture, trained their children in the composition of waka and later haiku. A warrior might spend a night before battle not in sharpening his sword but in shaping words. Death poems, those final utterances before seppuku or combat, were themselves poetry, distilled moments of impermanence, written with the same clarity Zen had taught. In the 17th century, Matsuo Basho, though not a samurai in the strict military sense, but carrying the values of discipline and travel associated with them, refined the art of haiku into what we remember today. His verses, simple yet profound, mirrored the samurai spirit, fleeting beauty, sharp as steel, brief as breath. Imagine Basho walking the northern roads, his sandals worn, his staff tapping against the stones, writing of frogs leaping into ponds, of the silence after thunder. His poetry was not war, but it was Bushido's echo in art. Beyond poetry, the theater of No captured the imagination of the warrior class. With its masked actors, slow movements, and sparse staging, No was an art of restraint, like swordsmanship, every gesture precise, every silence charged. Samurai lords became patrons of No, sponsoring performances not as mere entertainment, but as reflections of the warrior's own struggles, plays of ghosts, of duty, of betrayal, of honor carried beyond death. Watching No was not passive, it was meditation through theater. Linked to No was the tea ceremony, shinoya. Here, too, Zen ideals infused practice, but for the samurai, it became a ritual of balance. In the tea room, swords were left at the door. Status vanished. Daimyo, retainers, and even guests of lesser rank sat as equals before a steaming bowl of tea. The ceremony was discipline in miniature. Every movement, lifting the ladle, folding the cloth, whisking the tea, was performed with exactness, no different than a kata with a sword. In these rituals, the warrior learned humility, patience, and mindfulness. The arts also included the brush, calligraphy, and ink painting. Samurai ink scrolls often paired swift brushstrokes with poems or Zen koans. A single stroke, bold and irreversible, demanded the same courage as a sword cut. In painting, landscapes were rendered with spare detail, leaving empty space as vital as ink. What was not painted mattered as much as what was. In this, too, the warrior found reflection of his own life, presence within absence, silence within sound. Music, too, was not foreign to the warrior's world. The biwa, a lute-like instrument, often accompanied tales of the Haika, recounting the fall of the Taira clan in mournful tones. These songs reminded samurai of the impermanence of power, of the fragility of glory. Even the greatest clan could fall, their banners sinking into the sea like at Dan no Yura. Listening to the biwa's notes was both art and lesson. Art was not indulgence. It was discipline disguised. Just as a warrior's armor had both beauty and function, lacquered plates painted with clan crests, helmets adorned with horns or plumes, so too did art serve purpose. A poem taught mindfulness. A play taught reflection. A garden taught balance. A tea bowl taught humility. Each was another form of training, shaping the samurai spirit as surely as sparring in the art. And in peace, when the long centuries of Edo brought stability under Tokugawa rule, the arts became the primary battlefield for the samurai class. With war diminished, their swords rested in their scabbards. But their minds and spirits still sought expression. Samurai became scholars, poets, painters, keepers of tradition. Their roles shifted, but the essence remained: to discipline the self, to live with honor, to leave behind something of beauty. Imagine yourself now walking through a daimyo's castle not during war but during festival. In one hall, warriors sit composing verses. In another, a no play unfolds, the masked actor moving with aching slowness, the audience hushed. In yet another chamber, the clink of a tea bowl, the brush of cloth, the silence between sips. And in the gardens outside, lanterns glow upon raked sand, upon rocks placed with eternal care. All of it is Bushidō, transformed into art. The samurai lived with paradox, to kill with precision, and to write with delicacy, to ride into battle, and to sit in quiet rooms measuring words and breaths. Yet it was this paradox that gave them depth. Without art, they were mere soldiers. With art, they were samurai. And so, as we leave behind the sound of brush upon paper, the rustle of silk robes in the tea room, the echo of massed voices upon the no stage, we find ourselves standing before another truth of the warrior's world: their bodies, clad not only in spirit and culture, but in armor itself, lacquered, laced, fierce in design. That is where our steps now carry us. Ye have just left the hushed rooms where warriors composed poems, where tea bowls steamed in dim light, where masked actors moved with aching grace upon the no stage. But when the samurai rose from those chambers and prepared again for war, they did not step out into the world bare. They clothed themselves in another art, one made not of ink or verse, but of lacquered iron and silk cords, of horns and masks, of weight and terror. Now, as if following them through the castle gates, we move into the clang and rattle of the armory, into the world of samurai armor. Imagine a warrior kneeling upon the wooden floor, attendants bustling around him. One ties the cords of a lacquered cuirass, another adjusts the crest upon his helmet, another fastens the plates at his shins. Piece by piece, the man is transformed. Where once there was flesh and cloth, now stands a figure of iron and lacquer, bright cords weaving strength and color together. The armor of the samurai was not only protection. It was identity. It was art. It was terror. The earliest samurai armor, in the Heian period, was the oyoroi, the great armor. Heavy, box-like, built for mounted archers, it covered the body with lamellar plates, small rectangles of iron or leather, lacquered to resist weather, laced together with silk or leather cord in intricate patterns. Bright orange, deep blue, stark white, the cords were not random decoration. They announced clan, rank, and taste, just as much as a poem or a family crest. The great cuirass encased the torso, while massive shoulder guards, sodi, flared outward like wings, giving the warrior a striking silhouette as he loosed arrows from horseback. On his head, the kabuto, the helmet, completed the transformation. Rounded, flaring at the neck to deflect blows, it was crowned with a crest, made 8. Some bore antlers, others horns, others abstract symbols or divine figures. To see an enemy rider cresting the hill with antlers towering from his helm was to face not only a man, but a myth made flesh. And then there was the mask, the menpo. Crafted of iron or leather, painted or lacquered, it covered the face from nose downward, sometimes with fierce mustaches of horsehair, sometimes twisted into grimaces. These were not only practical, deflecting arrows and blades. They were psychological weapons. To look into the eyes of a warrior framed by such a mask was to see a demon of war. But armor did not remain static. As warfare shifted from duels of mounted archers to the press of infantry in the Kamakura and Muromachi periods, armor changed with it. The box-like Oyoroi gave way to the Dumaru and Haramaki, lighter, closer-fitting cuirassas that allowed freedom of movement. These could be worn by foot soldiers as well as mounted samurai, making them more versatile in the age of massed battles. The silhouette slimmed, the lines grew closer to the body. Where once armor made a man monumental, now it made him agile. By the Sengoku Jidai, the age of warring states, armor had evolved yet again. Battles were vast, with armies numbering in the tens of thousands, and the weapons of war had changed. Spears thrust in great blocks. Firearms cracked from lines of Ishigaru. Armor grew lighter, more practical. The Tozai Gusoku, modern armor, emerged, built from larger iron plates riveted together, designed to resist bullets as well as arrows. Some even bore bullet dents polished smooth, displayed proudly as proof of resilience. Yet even in practicality, art never vanished. Samurai armor remained a canvas of expression. Lacquer gleamed black or vermilion. Silk cords braided in elaborate patterns crisscrossed the plates. Helmets bore horns, crescents, suns, dragons. One daimyo might wear a helmet shaped like a seashell, another like a rabbit, another crowned with towering antlers. To march into battle was not merely to fight, it was to perform, to embody a legend before the eyes of all. The rituals of donning armor reflected its gravity. A samurai did not simply dress, he was dressed, transformed by attendants into something greater than himself. Each knot tied, each plate fastened, was a step closer to becoming the warrior he was sworn to be. To strip a fallen enemy of his armor was to strip him of identity, of honor, reducing him from myth to mortal once more. Consider the sheer sensory presence of armor. The creak of silk cords drawn taut. The smell of lacquer, sharp and earthy. The weight upon the shoulders, at once burden and strength. The clatter of plates as one walked, a sound both reassuring to allies and terrifying to foes. To wear armor was to carry one's clan, one's history, upon one's very body. And yet, armor was not invulnerable. Arrows could pierce at weak joints. Swords could slip between plates. Spears could strike the unguarded face or neck. And when firearms arrived in the 16th century, armor makers faced new challenges. Thicker plates, angled surfaces, experimentation with designs, all emerged as warriors struggled to preserve the balance between mobility and protection. Still, armor endured, not only as defense but as symbol. Even in the long peace of the Tokugawa shogunate, when battles dwindled and swords remained sheathed, samurai armor was maintained, displayed, paraded. To see a warrior in lacquered plates and crested helm was to see the past walking still, a reminder of what had been. Today, when we look upon samurai armor in museums, black lacquer shining under lights, silk cords faded but still bright, masks frozen in eternal grimace, we see not only war gear. We see sculpture. We see theater. We see Bushidō made visible. Each plate, each knot, each crest tells a story, of a family, of a battle, of a man who once stood clad in iron, ready to die for honor. And as we step now from the armory, past rows of silent cuirassas, past helmets that once crowned the heads of daimyo, past masks that once terrified foes on burning fields, we find ourselves drawn not to the anonymous mass of warriors but to the individuals who rose above them, men whose names endured beyond their lifetimes, whose deeds shaped not only battles but legend. It is toward them that our path now turns, toward the great and legendary samurai who carved their place in history. Now we turn toward those individuals, the legendary samurai, whose stories pulse through centuries like drums still echoing across the mountains. Picture the battlefield, banners snapping in the wind, the ground quaking beneath hoofbeats. Thousands clash, but among them one figure shines brighter, moving with a brilliance that lingers long after the dust has settled. These are the men who became more than samurai. They became symbols. Their lives, often short, often tragic, enter the bloodstream of Japan's history, carried forward in song, tale, and memory. Let us begin with Minamoto no Yoshitsune, the tragic genius of the 12th century. Younger brother to Minamoto no Yoritomo, the first shogun, Yoshitsune was a warrior of dazzling talent. Trained in his youth by the Karama monks, and, legend says, taught secret techniques by the Tengu, mystical beings of the mountains, he grew into a commander whose strategies astonished his enemies. At the Battle of Ichinatani in 1184, Yoshitsune led a daring cavalry charge down a near vertical cliff, catching the Taira unprepared and crushing their lines. A year later, at the great naval battle of Dan no Yura, he outmaneuvered the Taira fleet, ending their dynasty. Yet for all his brilliance, Yoshitsune's fate was betrayal. His brother Yoritomo, threatened by his fame, turned against him. Hunted, Yoshitsune fled north, finally forced to commit seppuku in 1189. But in death he became legend. Ballads and plays remembered him as the noble, tragic hero undone by envy. Some even whispered he survived and fled across the sea, living on in disguise. To this day, Yoshitsune is remembered not merely as a general, but as the embodiment of brilliance destroyed by fate. From Yoshitsune's era we move forward to the Sengoku period, when the land itself fractured into endless war. Here we meet Takeda Shingen, the Tiger of Kai. Born in 1521, Shingen built his clan into one of the most powerful in Japan. He was famed for his cavalry, for his banners that bore the phrase, "Swift as the wind, silent as the forest, fierce as fire, immovable as the mountain," a maxim drawn from Sun Tzu, yet perfectly suited to the Japanese battlefield. Shingen clashed again and again with Yasuji Kenshin, the Dragon of Ekigo, in battles that became legendary not only for their ferocity but for the strange mutual respect between the two warlords. At Kawanakajima, their armies met in 5 great battles, each leaving the field soaked with blood, yet neither side claiming final victory. Yasuji Kenshin himself deserves equal remembrance. Devoutly Buddhist, fiercely honorable, he was said to pray before statues of Bishamonten, the god of war, believing himself the deity's earthly incarnation. His rivalry with Shingen became almost mythic, tiger and dragon locked in eternal struggle. One tale tells of Kenshin riding straight into Shingen's camp, striking at him personally with a sword while Shingen defended with only a war fan. Whether true or not, the story endures as a glimpse of their fierce, almost theatrical rivalry. When Shingen died in 1573, Kenshin is said to have wept, grieving not only an enemy but a worthy adversary who had given his life meaning. As the Sengoku fires raged on, other figures rose. Oda Nobunaga, ruthless and brilliant, shattered the old order with firepower and ambition. Though not remembered as a paragon of Bushidō, he was too brutal, too pragmatic. His role in unifying Japan made him legendary in his own right. At the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, Nobunaga deployed massed volleys of arquebusiers, mowing down Takeda cavalry and proving that even the proudest samurai must bow to the gun. And yet, Nobunaga's story ended in betrayal. His general Akechi Mitsuhide turned on him in 1582, forcing him to commit seppuku in the burning halls of Honnoji Temple. His death was dramatic, his legacy undeniable. Without him, the unification of Japan would not have begun. Nobunaga's mantle fell to Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a man of peasant birth who rose through talent alone to rule all of Japan. Known as the Monkey, in his youth for his appearance, Hideyoshi became the ultimate symbol of ambition transcending class. Though not born samurai, he reshaped their world, freezing social mobility so that no one else could rise as he had. Under him, Japan launched invasions of Korea, campaigns vast and brutal, though ultimately unsuccessful. His life, too, became legend, the boy of humble origins who seized the world, only to leave it fragile, unstable, awaiting the next power. And then came Tokugawa Ieyasu, patient as stone, who bided his time through decades of turmoil until at last, in 1600, he won the great battle of Sekigahara. From that victory he forged the Tokugawa shogunate, a peace that would last more than 250 years. Though less flamboyant than Yoshitsune, less fierce than Shingen, less audacious than Nobunaga, Ieyasu's legacy outshone them all in endurance. His was the victory of patience, of survival, of the long game played to its end. Beyond these lords and generals, there were also warriors remembered for personal skill, for the sheer artistry of combat. None more so than Miyamoto Musashi. Born in 1584, Musashi fought his first duel at 13, slaying a grown man with a wooden sword. He went on to win over 60 duels, never defeated, his fame spreading across the land. But Musashi was more than a swordsman. He was a strategist, an artist, a thinker. In his later years he wrote the Book of Five Rings, a masterpiece of martial philosophy that remains studied worldwide. He taught that combat was not only about technique, but about mind, spirit, rhythm. His style of fighting with two swords, the katana and the shorter wakizashi, became part of his legend. Yet perhaps even more legendary was his disdain for luxury, his life of wandering, his pursuit of mastery in all forms. Musashi was the sword made flesh, but also the brush, the chisel, the thought. Not every legendary samurai was a man of victory. Some became immortal through failure, through death embraced with honor. The tale of the 47 Ronin, masterless warriors who avenged their lord in 1703, is perhaps the most famous. For 2 years they waited, biding their time, until they struck down the man responsible for their lord's death. Then, having fulfilled their duty, they surrendered to the shogunate and committed seppuku together. Their graves at Sengakuji Temple became a site of pilgrimage, their story retold in countless plays and tales. They were not generals, not rulers, not undefeated swordsmen. They were men who chose loyalty beyond life, and in that choice, they became eternal. Legends, then, were not born only of victory, but of the way a samurai lived and died. Yoshitsune's brilliance, Shingen's tiger banners, Kenshin's prayers, Nobunaga's ruthlessness, Hideyoshi's rise, Ieyasu's patience, Musashi's mastery, the Ronin's loyalty, each carved a different facet of what it meant to be samurai. Each became a mirror, reflecting not only the warrior class but the ideals, the contradictions, the tragedies of Japan itself. Close your eyes, and you can still hear them. Yoshitsune's charge down the cliff. Shingen's cavalry thundering across the field. Kenshin praying before Bishimonten. Nobunaga's guns cracking at Nagashino. Hideyoshi's armies crossing the sea. Ieyasu watching, waiting, seizing destiny. Musashi stepping barefoot into a duel at dawn, wooden sword in hand. The Ronin kneeling upon tatami, blades poised for the final cut. They are gone, but their echoes remain. And as we leave their shadows behind, our path leads us toward a moment when those echoes met new sounds, the thunder of foreign ships, the crack of European guns, the ringing of church bells brought from across the seas. For the samurai did not live in a closed world forever. One day, strangers arrived upon their shores, carrying weapons, faith, and ideas that would transform the way of the warrior. It is toward that encounter that we now walk. It is the year 1543. Off the southern coast, near the island of Tanegashima, a Chinese ship is driven by storm. Among its passengers are men unlike any the Japanese have seen before. Portuguese traders, their skin pale, their beards thick, their speech a torrent of unfamiliar sounds. They bring with them strange goods, glass beads, tobacco, woolen cloth. But most importantly, they carry weapons unlike any Japan has ever known, matchlock guns. When the locals first saw these firearms, they must have seemed like magic. With a pull of the trigger, fire spat from the barrel, smoke billowed, and a small lead ball struck with deadly force. No bowstring drawn, no sword raised, only fire and thunder. For a people who had lived by the bow and the blade for centuries, this was a revelation. Within a year, Japanese smiths were studying, copying, and perfecting the design. The weapon came to be called the Tanegashima, after the island where it first appeared. And so, with that storm-driven ship, the world of the samurai began to change. At first, the gun was a curiosity, expensive and rare. Daimyo bought them as status symbols, as novelties to show off at court. But some saw deeper. Oda Nobunaga, ruthless and visionary, understood the potential of these weapons. At the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, he unleashed them on a scale Japan had never seen. 3,000 arquebusiers, trained to fire in volleys, protected behind wooden palisades. When Takeda's Shinjin's cavalry charged, they were cut down in waves by musket fire. The age of the mounted archer, proud symbol of the early samurai, was shattered in an afternoon. The gun did not erase the sword. The katana remained the soul of the samurai, but it changed the face of war. Armor grew heavier in places, designed to deflect bullets. Formations shifted. Infantry, once little more than supporting troops, now carried decisive power. The samurai, once supreme in single combat, had to reckon with the anonymous, collective force of gunfire. But the Portuguese brought more than weapons. They brought faith. Jesuit missionaries soon followed, led by men like Francis Xavier, arriving in 1549. They came clad not in armor but in robes, preaching a new religion, Christianity. For some daimyo, especially in Kyushu, conversion brought not only spiritual promise but political advantage, securing trade and weapons from the Portuguese. Entire domains embraced the new faith. Churches rose where temples once stood. Samurai themselves converted, some sincerely, others pragmatically. This mingling of faith and power created tensions. Buddhism had long been intertwined with samurai life, Zen shaping their discipline, temples supporting their clans. Christianity disrupted these bonds. Some samurai found inspiration in its teachings of humility and salvation. Others feared its undermining of loyalty and order. The sword and the cross stood uneasily side by side. Meanwhile, European traders introduced other novelties: clocks, maps, eyeglasses, exotic foods. For the first time, Japan glimpsed itself in the context of a wider world, a world of empires and oceans. Some daimyo embraced these changes eagerly, sending envoys abroad. In 1582, for young Japanese boys, known as the Tensho Embassy, were sent to Europe, traveling as far as Rome, where they were received by the Pope himself. Imagine the astonishment of those young emissaries, raised among tatami mats and temples, standing beneath the domes of cathedrals, hearing the swell of Western choirs. Yet for all this openness, suspicion lingered. By the early 1600s, under Tokugawa Ieyasu and his successors, the tide turned. The shogunate grew wary of Christian influence, fearing it undermined loyalty to the shogun. Rebellions, such as the Shimabara uprising of 1637, in which many peasants and Christian samurai rose against their lords, seemed to confirm these fears. The revolt was crushed with brutal force, tens of thousands killed. Afterward, Christianity was outlawed, missionaries expelled, converts forced to renounce their faith or face death. Thus began Japan's long period of isolation, Sakoku. For over 2 centuries, foreign contact was tightly restricted. The Portuguese were expelled. Only the Dutch were allowed limited trade through Nagasaki, their contact confined to a small island, Dejima. Guns did not disappear. They were stored away, used sparingly, but the sword regained symbolic primacy. The samurai returned to their rituals, their arts, their governance, while the outside world surged on. Still, the memory of those first encounters lingered. The arquebus had changed warfare. The cross had shaken belief. And though the shogunate sought to close the gates, the ocean remained, vast and patient. One day, ships would return, larger and darker, with steam and cannon, demanding once again that Japan face the world. But that moment lies ahead. For now, in the 16th and 17th centuries, the samurai stood at a crossroads, between tradition and change, between sword and gun, between temple and church. Some embraced the new. Some resisted. All felt the tremors of a world wider than the islands they had called their own. Imagine yourself on the shore of Tanegashima, watching that first Portuguese ship drift into sight. The locals murmur, unsure whether it is demon or miracle. The strangers step ashore, bearded, strange-tongued, carrying fire in their hands. None present could know how much had just shifted, how deeply those ripples would run. And as we walk away from those shores, leaving behind the clash of arquebuses, the ring of church bells, the whispered prayers of converts and the grim edicts of the shogunate, our path leads into a new age, the long peace of the Tokugawa, where the samurai laid down their weapons and took up the burdens of governance, administration, and restraint. An age when the warrior became something quieter, yet no less bound by duty. Let us walk onward, the tide of time carrying us gently but firmly forward. We have just stood on the windswept shores of Tanegashima, watching the first Portuguese guns fire smoke into the Japanese sky, hearing Jesuit bells ring faintly through the mountains, watching the uneasy mingling of faith, fire, and steel. Yet as quickly as those currents came, they were sealed off. The shogunate turned inward, doors shut, sails furled, the islands wrapped in silence. And in that silence, something extraordinary took root, the long, unbroken calm of Tokugawa rule. Now we step into that stillness, into the age of the Tokugawa shogunate. It begins with the year 1600, on the misted plains of Sekigahara. Imagine the valley that morning, banners fluttering like a forest of colors, the ground sodden with autumn dew, the air tense with the breath of two great armies. Tokugawa Ieyasu, patient old fox, commands one side. His rivals, the Western army loyal to Toyotomi Hideori, command the other. For hours, the armies clash in mud and fog, blades striking, muskets cracking. But then betrayal tips the balance. Allies of the Toyotomi switch sides, their banners turning against them. By day's end, the Western army lies broken, the plain littered with bodies, crows circling overhead. From this field of death rose peace. Tokugawa Ieyasu, victor of Sekigahara, soon declared himself shogun in 1603. Unlike Nobunaga's fire or Hideyoshi's ambition, Ieyasu's gift was patience. He consolidated power carefully, weaving webs of loyalty and control that would outlast him. When he died in 1616, the Tokugawa shogunate was secure, destined to rule for 2.5 centuries. For the samurai, this new age brought transformation. No longer were they warriors first, for great battles dwindled. Instead, they became administrators, scholars, bureaucrats, guardians of law and order. Their swords remained at their sides, but often they were more symbol than necessity. In a world without constant war, the samurai's role shifted from battlefield to castle town, from charging cavalry to clerks and magistrates. And yet, the code of Bushidō did not vanish. If anything, it became sharper, more codified, as samurai sought to define themselves in peace. Honor, loyalty, obedience, these became the pillars upon which they stood. The sword, though rarely drawn, was polished daily, a reminder of who they were meant to be. Society itself was reshaped. The Tokugawa rulers enforced a strict hierarchy, samurai at the top, then peasants, artisans, and merchants at the bottom. And yet irony played its hand. Over the long years of peace, merchants grew rich, while many samurai, bound by duty and barred from trade, grew poor. Picture a samurai walking the streets of Edo, his armor pawned, his rice stipend barely enough to feed his family, while merchants in silk strolled past, their coffers heavy with coin. The tension simmered quietly, unspoken but undeniable. Edo, today's Tokyo, swelled into one of the largest cities in the world. Imagine its avenues crowded with processions of daimyo, required by law to travel regularly to the capital in a system known as Senkinkotai. Each lord had to maintain a residence in Edo and spend alternate years there, leaving his family behind when he returned to his domain. This kept them loyal, for their wives and children were effectively hostages. The streets glittered with these processions, banners high, retainers marching in rows, lacquered palanquins swaying. Samurai discipline became spectacle. But beneath the order, culture blossomed. With peace came time for art, theater, literature. Kabuki emerged, flamboyant and colorful, a counterpoint to the austere no once favored by warlords. Ukiyo-e woodblock prints flourished, depicting actors, courtesans, landscapes. Samurai, though bound by duty, often found themselves drawn to these pleasures, slipping into theaters, collecting prints, visiting the pleasure quarters. The floating world, ephemeral and glittering, grew alongside the rigid order of Bushidō. Yet the contradictions of the age were many. A samurai was forbidden to work in trade, yet his stipend might not feed him. He was sworn to uphold dignity, yet poverty often pushed him into debt. Some became masterless, ronin, drifting between towns, teaching swordsmanship, or turning to banditry. The 47 ronin, whose tale we have already touched, embodied this tension, men without lords, yet still clinging fiercely to honor. The Tokugawa age also deepened Japan's isolation. Foreign trade was confined to Nagasaki, where Dutch merchants brought glimpses of a wider world, telescopes, globes, books of science, but only in controlled trickles. For most samurai, the outside world became distant rumor. Instead, their gaze turned inward, to Confucian studies, to martial training maintained in theory, to poetry, calligraphy, and ritual. Yet peace did not mean stagnation. Samurai scholars recorded histories, codified laws, debated philosophy. Some became teachers, spreading Confucian ethics to commoners. Others turned to martial schools, preserving swordsmanship as art rather than necessity. The martial spirit was not extinguished, only redirected. Still, imagine the weight of those centuries. A class born in blood, raised for war, now confined to offices and stipends, their swords sheathed. A samurai in Edo might live his whole life without once drawing his blade in battle. For some, this was dignity, a higher, purer discipline. For others, it was slow suffocation. Yet through it all, the Tokugawa order held. No great wars shattered the peace. No foreign powers invaded. Children grew, married, and died in the same calm their parents had known. Rice ripened in the paddies. Lanterns glowed in Edo's streets. Samurai walked their rounds silent, vigilant, symbols of an order so vast and steady it seemed eternal. But history does not rest forever. Beyond Japan's shores, the world was changing. Empires expanded, oceans were crossed, cannons thundered. And one day, black ships would appear on the horizon, smoke rising from their funnels, carrying demands that no shogun could ignore. When they came, the long peace would crack, and the samurai would face a reckoning like none before. For now, though, let us linger in that stillness, the age of processions through Edo's streets, of woodblock prints and kabuki plays, of samurai polishing swords they might never use, of a society balanced like a teacup on the edge of a tatami mat. The age of Tokugawa, both serene and strained, both ordered and restless. And as we step from those quiet streets, hearing in the distance the faint creak of sails and the ominous hum of the world beyond, we move toward the final act, the fall of the samurai, when all that had been built over centuries would collapse beneath the weight of change. Now we step into that twilight, the fall of the samurai. It begins with smoke on the horizon. The year is 1853. Off the coast of Edo Bay, black ships appear, not of wood and sail alone, but driven by steam, belching smoke, bristling with cannon. At their head is Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy, carrying a letter from his president demanding that Japan open its ports. The shogunate, long secure in its isolation, is suddenly confronted with a world of iron and empire. The samurai, heirs of centuries of ritual and honor, gaze upon these ships and see a future they cannot stop. In 1854, Japan signed the Convention of Kanagawa, opening its ports under duress. Soon other Western powers followed: Britain, France, Russia. Trade expanded, but so too did resentment. Samurai walked the streets of Edo and Yokohama, their swords clashing with foreign merchants, their pride wounded by treaties signed under threat. The old order trembled. The cracks widened in the 1860s. Some samurai, particularly in the southern domains of Satsuma and Chashu, saw the weakness of the shogunate and pushed for restoration of imperial power. They carried banners of Sano joy. Revere the emperor, expelled the barbarians. Streets erupted in violence. Ronin assassinated officials. Foreign settlements were attacked. Gunfire echoed where once only ritual duels had. In 1868, the storm broke. The Bashan War erupted, pitting the shogunate against the imperial loyalists. Samurai fought on both sides, some defending the Tokugawa, others rallying to the emperor. Battles raged from Toba Fushimi to Aizu, muskets and cannon alongside swords and spears. At Hakodate in 1869, the last shogunate loyalists, led by the tragic figure Inomoto Takeaki, even tried to establish a short-lived Republic of Ezo in Hokkaido. But they, too, fell. The Tokugawa shogunate was abolished. The emperor was restored. The Meiji era began. For the samurai, the new age was disorienting. Their stipends were gradually abolished. Their privileges stripped away. The right to carry swords in public, once the very mark of their identity, was outlawed by the Heitoriai Edict of 1876. Imagine the weight of that decree: a class that had lived for the sword, suddenly told to lay it down. Samurai, once feared and revered, now found themselves wandering into obscurity. Some became officials, teachers, or soldiers in the new conscript army. Others slipped into poverty. Their castles were dismantled. Their crests faded. Their world, centuries in the making, dissolved in a matter of decades. But not all accepted this quietly. In 1877, the last great blaze of samurai resistance erupted: the Satsuma Rebellion, led by Saigō Takamori. Saigō, once a hero of the Meiji Restoration, turned against the new government when he saw how quickly it discarded the samurai way. With thousands of followers, many former samurai stripped of rank and honor, he rose in revolt, marching against the imperial forces. For months they fought, sword against rifle, courage against modernity. At Shiroyama, in September 1877, the rebellion met its end. Surrounded, outnumbered, outgunned, Saigō and his men charged one last time, blades drawn, into the fire of modern artillery and rifles. The slaughter was swift, but their defiance immortal. Saigō fell, whether by enemy fire or his own blade, accounts differ, and with him, the age of the samurai fell too. The Meiji state pressed forward. Railways spread. Western uniforms replaced kimono. Conscription replaced hereditary warrior bands. The sword, once the soul of the samurai, became instead a relic, displayed in shrines and museums. And yet, in their fall, the samurai became myth. Plays, novels, woodblock prints retold their loyalty, their valor, their tragic resistance. Saigō himself, though branded a rebel, was later pardoned and remembered as a hero. The last samurai. Imagine, for a moment, a samurai of the 17th century transported into the streets of Tokyo in 1900. Where once he walked among castles and processions, he now sees trains roaring, telegraph wires strung across the sky, soldiers in Western uniforms marching in step. His world is gone. And yet, in the heart of the people, in memory, in story, the samurai spirit endures. Their fall was not only political or social. It was emotional, cultural, spiritual. A way of life, defined by Bushidō, by service, by the sword, dissolved into modernity. But like the cicada whose cry fades into summer air, its silence became part of Japan's rhythm. The samurai were gone, but their echoes shaped what came after. And as we leave the battlefields of Satsuma behind, the smoke still rising from Shiroyama, we find ourselves standing in the quiet after storm. The samurai are no more, yet their values linger, their myths flourish, their presence haunts the modern age. It is toward that legacy that our path now turns. Let us take the final steps, keeping the pace steady, unbroken. We have just walked away from the smoldering slopes of Shiroyama, where Saigō Takamori and his followers made their last, doomed charge, where bullets and cannon tore down the final stand of the warrior class. The samurai had fallen, their castles dismantled, their stipends abolished, their swords outlawed. And yet, like smoke that lingers long after fire has died, their spirit remained. It did not vanish with the men who carried it. It shifted, transformed, leaving behind a legacy that still breathes in Japan and beyond. Now we step into that legacy, into the afterlife of the samurai. When the Meiji government swept away the old order, it did so with urgency. Japan rushed headlong into modernity. Railways across the islands, factories rising, armies drilled in Western style. The world of lords and retainers, of processions through Edo streets, seemed to vanish almost overnight. Yet the soul of the samurai proved too deeply woven into the fabric of Japan to be erased. Bushidō, once the living code of a warrior class, was reframed as the moral foundation of the nation. Writers in the late 19th century, most famously Naito Benatsu in his Bushidō, The Soul of Japan, 1900, reinterpreted the code as a philosophy of honor, loyalty, and discipline suited not just to samurai, but to modern citizens. What had once been the creed of a narrow elite became a national ethic. In classrooms, children learned not of battlefield charges but of loyalty to emperor and state, duty to family, self-discipline in study. The sword had become a metaphor, Bushidō a moral compass. The military, too, drew upon this inheritance. The newly conscripted army, dressed in Western uniforms, drilled with rifles, nonetheless infused its ethos with samurai ideals. The Meiji state cultivated the image of the soldier as the new samurai, fighting not for a daimyo but for the emperor, not for clan but for nation. In this way, the spirit of the warrior was reborn, redirected into modern war. But the legacy extended far beyond the military. In culture, the samurai lived on in story, art, and memory. Plays and novels celebrated their loyalty, their tragic ends, their noble sacrifices. The tale of the 47 Ronin was retold endlessly, on stage and in print, becoming a national myth of loyalty beyond death. Miyamoto Musashi's Book of Five Rings was studied not only by martial artists but by businessmen, philosophers, anyone seeking strategy and clarity. Even as trains roared and telegraphs hummed, the voices of old warriors whispered still through the culture. The sword, outlawed in public life, returned as symbol. Katana became family heirlooms, sacred treasures passed down not for combat but for memory. In shrines, swords were enshrined as relics. In martial arts, kenjutsu evolved into kendo, fencing with bamboo swords, preserving the spirit of the blade in practice and sport. The arts of archery, horsemanship, and other disciplines became ways of cultivating mind and body, even without war. The samurai lived on in practice, ritual, discipline. Internationally, the image of the samurai fascinated outsiders. Western travelers to Japan in the late 19th century wrote of a people disciplined, courteous, yet fiercely proud. The samurai became emblematic of Japan itself, mysterious, noble, austere. In literature, in exhibitions, in early films, the figure of the samurai was romanticized, standing as the Japanese counterpart to the knight of medieval Europe. Naito's book spread this idea widely, painting Bushidō as a code of chivalry that the world could understand. But the legacy was not only romantic. In the early 20th century, Bushido ideals were invoked to demand sacrifice in war, to fuel nationalism, to justify expansion abroad. In World War II, soldiers were urged to fight with the spirit of the samurai, to embrace death before dishonor, to charge against tanks and guns with the courage of their ancestors. Kamikaze pilots were hailed as modern samurai, their final letters echoing the death poems of old. Here, the legacy of the samurai, reframed and politicized, took on a darker hue. And yet, after the war, when Japan lay in ruins and rebuilt itself anew, the samurai spirit surfaced again, not in violence, but in discipline, in craftsmanship, in devotion to work. The precision of Japanese industry, the pursuit of perfection in everything from automobiles to tea ceremonies, carried echoes of Bushido's demand for mastery. A swordsmith's dedication lived on in engineer's exactness, in artisan's patience, in the pride of doing one's task to its utmost. Today, the samurai live most vividly in imagination. Films by Kurosawa, Seven Samurai Yojimbo, Ran, carried their image to the world, their silhouettes striding through rain and wind, their swords flashing in cinematic storms. Novels, comics, anime, video games retell their tales endlessly, from historical epics to fantastical reimaginings. To millions far from Japan, the samurai stand as symbols of honor, discipline, and tragedy. But beyond the stories, there remains something quieter. In Japan, one still finds their spirit in small things, in the bow of a kendoka before a match, in the careful whisk of tea in a ceremony, in the way a craftsman shapes wood or steel with patience. The samurai live not only in armor on display, but in habits of respect, precision, dedication. Their legacy is less a relic than a current, running still beneath the surface of modern life. Imagine walking now through a museum hall. Around you stand suits of lacquered armor, masks grimacing, helmets crowned with horns. In glass cases lie swords, their steel polished to a mirror, their edges sharp enough to whisper through air. The samurai are gone, their castles fallen, their banners tattered. And yet in that hall you feel their presence, their gaze, their silence. They are not past. They are memory. They are legacy. And so our journey, which began with the rise of mounted archers in the Heian fields, winds now to its close. We have walked among daimyo courts, through monasteries where Zen shaped discipline, across battlefields littered with banners, through tea rooms filled with quiet ceremony. We have watched the samurai rise, transform, decline, and fall. And still they remain, not in flesh, not in power, but in spirit. For history does not end. It echoes. It flows into the present, shaping how we think, how we dream, how we tell our stories. The samurai are gone, and yet they are still with us. And so, as the night settles, as the echoes fade, may the spirit of the samurai walk with you still, a reminder of courage, of discipline, of loyalty, of beauty amid struggle. Their way, their legacy, endures, not as armor or sword, but as a whisper in the soul.